Welcome to Sunflower Movement. I am your host, Ashley Buckner. Before we get started, here's a quick disclaimer. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. I am a licensed therapist, but unless you have a signed consent form with me, I am not your therapist. This platform is not a form of psychotherapy, counseling, or healthcare of any kind. Sunflowers bloom in the most unexpected places, and they adjust to remain connected to the sun. Metaphorically, I define these sunflower movements as experiences with people, places, and moments where we feel seen, heard, and believed. Thank you for tuning in. I wanted to give you all an update about my prana mat. If you follow me, you know I use the prana mat. I talk about it quite frequently. I will say the mat itself is spendy, and I also want to say that I use the mat every single day, so it is something that you can get your money's worth if you're interested. How I use the mat is I lay on it in various parts of my body, mostly my back and my shoulders, especially if I have a lot of tension up there in my neck. I also will use it on the back of my legs, my hamstrings, especially if I get a hard workout in and I'm feeling sore. Also, the game-changing place for me has been on my stomach. I lay on my stomach for about 20 minutes a day, and it has helped me reduce the extra skin and created more elasticity that I lost since having babies. It has been a night and day difference, and I love my mat for this reason because it's a very simple tool that I also get to decompress with. If you're interested, visit pranamat.com and use Ashley B at checkout. I am so excited to be partnering with Armra Colostrum. It is one of my favorite supplements. I've been using it for the last year. I have it every single day in my smoothies. I mix it in my hydration drinks, sometimes just in plain water. What I have noticed is that it really helps with my recovery. So after a hard workout, my body feels more rejuvenated. I have noticed my digestion is better. I have less overall bloating. Additionally, my hair is very strong and healthy and thick. Also, the immunity building part of this supplement is incredible. My kids have brought home so much sickness this year, and I have stayed relatively healthy. This is my go-to supplement. I have it every single day. Highly recommend. Use Ashley Buckner at checkout for a discount. Visit tryarmra.com. Welcome back, everyone. I am here with my friend Sam. You guys also know her as Sam the therapist. She has been on Sunflower Movement before, actually episode 13. So I definitely encourage you to tune in and just hear what she has to say on that episode. She shares her story. We talk about shame and guilt. It's just such a great episode, and I loved having Sam on. She was raised in the Mormon church. And today we're actually going to talk about grooming and the grooming for marriage that happens within Mormonism. And I really wanted Sam to come on today because we are both different. I am married and she is not.
Thank you.
So welcome, Sam.
Yeah, I'm very excited to be here. A little bit nervous, actually.
I'm kind of nervous too. I was actually going to tell you, I'm like a little emotional, and I don't know if it's just like collectively or what, but we'll see where this goes.
There's a lot happening for those of us that are on the emotional in tune side, emotionally in tuned. I think collectively there's a lot in the air right now, it feels.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. That's really validating my
I think it's not like I actually think like a lot of people that I've worked with right now lately, it kind of feels like the micro is okay. It's the macro. And I have clients who are like, well, like things feel kind of okay in my life, but it just feels like there's this very like heavy energy of doom. Like kind of just like heaviness and emotional fatigue and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Which we just absorb those energies for sure. I think also our topic today is it's a little dense. Yeah. So just for the listeners, if you don't follow me on Instagram, you should. No, I'm just kidding. But I did a series. It was probably a month ago, and it was just talking about how practices, because I speculate, and I've said this quite frequently, that Mormonism grooms us for marriage, especially as young girls. And I've made this comment on several pages in the Mormon space, obviously receiving some pushback on it. So I decided to do a series on my Instagram to ask my followers how they felt groomed. And I do not think I fully anticipated the response that was going to come in, and just all the different ways. I mean, going all the way back to people's baby blessings, where as they're receiving a baby blessing, the prayer is for them to get married to a worthy priesthood holder in the temple. And so obviously I've always known this, right? How many baby blessings have I listened to? How many baptisms have I attended growing up in the culture, but never really thought twice of it. And then looking at it from this lens, so many years outside of the church, talking about religious trauma and just the body and the nervous system absorbing messages, which we know that they absorb.
Regardless, whether you want them to absorb or not.
Exactly. And so it's all kind of just blew my mind. And I feel like I need to do a debrief. So thank you for debriefing with me.
It's literally what I do all day. Debrief with people. That's essentially our job as therapists.
That is essentially our job.
We come back and we're doing the debrief of the work and how it's going and the snag points and the wins.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've had a lot of reflections come up for myself, even my own decisions to get married. And my husband was never raised in the church, doesn't even know anything about Mormonism. He always mispronounces certain things, and it's so funny. He makes up names for them. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head, but one time he called the steak president the president's cup, and we always just joke with him on it because it's just funny. He just has no idea. So I didn't get married in the temple. God and Jesus were at my wedding. It was such a different experience. I didn't get married till I was 28 years old, but yet I've still had things come up but my worth was conditional on getting married, and I felt that. So, yeah, I don't know where you're at. Tell me a little bit about how you feel in regards to marriage and what you were taught marriage was about and all of those
things.
This
is really interesting that we're having this conversation, because literally yesterday, me and my really good friend and business partner, we were talking about all kinds of stuff that we're working on, and it ended up veering into a processing about my current situation with dating. And so I kind of had the ability to sort through some of this yesterday. And so now I'm coming to you with a more thought out vision. So the universe works in mysterious ways. But basically, so I was not raised in Utah. I was raised in the church, but I was not raised in Utah. When I was little, we lived in Arizona, which might as well be Utah South. But I wasn't there long enough to really have an impact, to have the church have an impact on me. It was obviously a consistent part of my life, but my parents, I think I talked about this in the last podcast episode. My parents were pretty laid back. My mom was a convert. My dad, his dad was never a member, never joined. So I think they already kind of had some more laid back, quote unquote, liberal views about stuff. So I just remember church kind of being a more fun thing. And it's just a thing that we do on Sundays, and we go and whatever, and we have family prayer and whatever. When I moved to New York, when I was 9, that's obviously, we know it, brain development, kind of a pivotal switch is starting to happen, right? That's about when you start to enter the tweens and you start to develop more cogent understanding of the world around you and the nuance of the human experience. So I went through essentially end of elementary school, middle school, and all of high school through living in New York. And there were some really cool people in the ward that I grew up in. And there were some really batshit crazy people in the ward that I grew up in. And in regards to marriage, there was definitely some undertones. We would speak about career and work and that, but there was still this when you get married, when you're a mom, when you do this, when you do that. It all was kind of painted as this inevitability.
Yeah,
Like there's
absolutely.
no room for it not to happen. And so you just kind of assume that that is your life, or it will be the trajectory of your life. Even though, like, looking back, I remember kind of feeling like I wasn't pulled in either way. Like I knew I wanted to get married. Um, I knew I wanted that for me, but it also wasn't, I had like other goals and dreams and visions for things that I wanted to do. So when I moved to Utah finally, when I was 18, I realized I was still like really heavy in the church from like 18 to about 25, 26. And if I look back at that time, I was like smack dab in the middle of the singles ward in like the heartland of Provo Orem. The heartland, the
heartland.
Mecca, all of it. And I remember like looking around and like no one was interesting to me. But also I wasn't interesting to them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like I didn't really fit the mold. I was loud. I was hilarious. I was like social and open and all these sorts of things. And I think a lot of Mormon men don't want that.
You were not
No,
keeping it sweet.
I was not sweet. I was very spicy and sassy. And I realized I kind of became like this token person in the ward. Because I was like a Sunday school teacher and I was actually very good at that, believe it or not.
Oh my gosh, you would be great at it. You would be great at it.
Killed it. And I noticed I kind of became a little bit like this, and I don't mean this in an arrogant way at all, but it was how I realized I was kind of treated as this like Sermon on the Mount person. Like,
yeah. Well, it was a way to
yes.
have power too, and a powerless system for
So
women.
I was kind of seen as this like oracle, you know, because I was starting to have kind of more like liberal views. I was in school for psych at the time, kind of introducing some of those principles. I was working for child and family services, so I was getting exposure to like all these different things, and I would put that into my lessons and blah blah blah. So I kind of became this like motivational speaker in whatever ward I was in, and there was just like a distance there. I also noted at that time I absolutely hated activities. I wanted nothing to do with family home evening. I wanted nothing to do with weeknight activities. When you're working 9 to 5, you don't want to go at 7 p.m. to have popsicles with a bunch of other 20-somethings. Like that's just not, you feel like you're suspended in this like young men's, young women's orbit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
absolutely.
I realized like at the time looking back on that, I was kind of resisting it even though I thought I was engaged with it. And then by the time I went to grad school for my master's in social work, that really got the wheels turning. And by that point, I really decided to like turn around and focus on my career and get creative with it. And I just kind of, because by that point, as I started to deconstruct, I realized, well, I don't want to stay in Utah. I don't even think I want to marry somebody in the church. Like, why would I go and do that here when I'm trying to figure out all this stuff over here? Right. And so I just kind of threw myself into my friends, my career, my family, figuring out my own life, doing all sorts of things. I traveled. I've been to Australia. I've been to England. I've been like Caribbean, like all these different places. And I when I realized I wanted to move and kind of nail down where I was moving to, I was very reflective of the fact that like I'm in my early 30s and I'm still single. And looking back to the early 20s piece, what I realized was I was so focused on thinking I needed someone in the church that I shut out any other option or possibility. So I was laser focused on this population that I didn't even think I wanted, but I felt like I had to want it.
Well, yeah, because I mean, you're told
Right.
for
Right.
forever. That's what I mean, from like
Yeah.
primary, like even
Yeah.
before you're
Yeah.
in young men's, young women's, you're learning
Yeah.
like this
You
is
need
what
a
you're supposed to
priesthood
do.
holder. You want a temple marriage. You want a sealing. You want all
Yep.
these sorts of things. And so now in this space that I'm in, with all of that said, and you know this as a therapist, there's a million different moments of reflection, good and bad, throughout all of this, right? So please, if you're listening to this, understand this is like a very high level summary of a lot of like complicated moments of my life. However, now being here, I've been in the Tampa Bay area for 2 months now, just a little over 2 months. And it's great and it's super refreshing and it's new. And you also have a lot of reflection of like where you came from. And I have
Absolutely.
2 thoughts about this idea of like my relationship to the LDS church in terms of like marriage and grooming and all of that. Now being where I am so grateful that I'm not married. I'm really grateful that I actually made it out of there without making that commitment to someone.
Absolutely.
And I have also very much had the thought, I think if I hadn't been raised in the church, I probably would have found someone by now.
Yeah. Well, and what's coming up for me too, now having listening to that whole story, right? You were in a dating pool with people you were not interested in dating. And you're exactly right. Had you been not so fixated on that aspect, you could have been exposed to so many other people that would have been interesting to you. And I think that is a very heavy insight.
And there's grief there and relief. And
so much.
It's a very odd space to sit with, because then there's also these moments where you're like, oh, I wasn't the problem. I'm not the problem. Because I think there's a lot of Mormon men who are in the dating pool that make it feel as if it is your problem if you have not been chosen.
Absolutely.
And so there's so many complicated emotions that come with it. And if you are listening to this and you're in this deconstruction process, maybe even starting to veer into the reconstruction, whatever you're feeling is valid. And I am a huge advocate for that, because we were raised in such a socially complex situation, such a complex, layered, nuanced, toxic environment that was sprinkled with some good.
Absolutely. And what's coming up for me too, as you're sharing this, because I'm going to a developmental trauma training for brain spotting in a month, and specifically because so much of this is developmental trauma that happens within the church, and just the fawn response in relation to that, because the fawn response is a relational trauma response. And I think it's just, it's really heavy. It's really dense. It's a lot to process, because it influenced and impacted so many life choices and decisions. And this is why the grief is so real, and why, I mean, I have so many people that are like, why can't I shake this? Why can't I let this go? And this is why, because I mean, we're the most vulnerable as children. And also to Sam's point earlier, as soon as you were like, oh, at 8, when everything's happening, I'm like, and 8, when everyone's getting baptized.
Yep.
Like it's so wild. And again, when you're in it, it's just normal. That's just what you do. Everyone's fawning. Everyone around you is fawning, because that's the only way you survive a high control setting. And it's miraculous, actually. I mean, it's really powerful what our nervous system will do to keep us safe until it's no longer serving us. Right. But it's just been so intertwined into our being. And I think that's what's the heaviest part of this.
And the personal work that I've done, and also the professional work that I've done with some of my clients who are deconstructing religion is this huge idea of, did I make choices because it was what I wanted, or did I make choices because it was what I thought I wanted? Because I had been told that's what I wanted. And I think even like boiling this down, because I think there's so many people that say like, well, you can't say that about like the church. The church didn't do that. You have freedom. You have choices, blah, 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 blah. You have this and that. Like nobody ever tells you that's what you have to do. And step back and think about the messaging that is given around those that don't have those things. Think about the messaging that is ascribed to people who have chosen quote unquote alternative paths. Right? Mm-hmm. And there's also, I find this not even just with people deconstructing from religion, but also survivors of childhood trauma in general. They feel once they hit adulthood and that frontal lobe finishes cooking and they kind of feel like they've woken up to life. Oh shit, I don't think any part of my 20s was authentic to what I would have wanted or what I would have done if I hadn't experienced A, B, C, D, E, F, G problem in my childhood, in my teens, in my young adult years. And so for so many men and women in the deconstructing era that have this, we professionally can only describe it as something that is traumatic. The social and cultural expectations around marriage are traumatic to children.
Absolutely. I'm so glad someone else is saying this.
I know I'm going to get like ripped to shreds, but I don't care anymore.
I know. I mean, but like, I think that's like, it's so sad that we feel scared to say that, or that people feel scared to say that, but that is so much a part of the culture too, right? And even for myself personally, it took me a long time, even though I had been out for a long time, it took me a long time to be able to say that out loud, because I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm just being honest. I'm being honest, and that's hard. And I get that honesty piece is hard, but it's true and it's real. When you were sharing a little bit about your story and just like the dynamics in singles ward, a thought that came up for me is like, I think people just get married to escape 100%. That dynamic.
100%.
And you know what I mean? And again, like that kind of stuff is really harmful.
Well,
and distressing.
Because also in the church, marriage is status.
Absolutely.
Marriage is status. My entire adult life in the church made me feel as if I was a second-class citizen. As a single woman, a single adult, who was over here building a career, or well, even before that, getting educated, working my tail off, building a career, then getting really creative with my career, like establishing all of these different opportunities and things that I've done over the years. And yet a woman who is 21 years old with a baby is seen as more mature than me.
Yeah. And to me, what comes up for me, I just feel for that 21-year-old woman with a baby so deeply, because I have said this, I know I've probably said this on this podcast before. Becoming a mom is one of the most activating things I've ever gone through in my entire life. And I was 30 years old when it happened. And it's incredibly heavy. And then you're immersed in a culture where your worth has been defined by getting married and having babies. And you're 21 years old, having a baby. And it's really heavy. And I see it so often in so many women that I work with, and it breaks my heart, because a lot of them are stuck and they feel very stuck. And again, like I don't know what the answer is, because all options are pretty shitty. You know, and there is this huge element of grief, just like you talked about. And it's
very heavy. And I too have clients that question, and not even question, to have the bravery to stand up and say, I wouldn't have done this. I wouldn't have been married. I wouldn't have had my kids. And I think that is so uncomfortable for people who have not stepped into the deconstruction space to understand, because they are still so firmly rooted in that belief system that this is the best and only thing that they could do. And so they hear that, and there's just this aggressiveness in the response, right? Because essentially what we're doing when we start to question this is we're holding a mirror up to them. And I think
Absolutely.
if you're listening to this and you feel like you're the only one in your family that is doing this work, and you feel like you're getting a lot of pushback as you start to talk about these things, it is because you are holding up the mirror to people's own disappointments and insecurities. And people who are not prepared to see that and look at that will do everything they can to turn away.
Yeah. And I often talk about it in terms of trauma and the nervous system response. It is so distressing for their nervous system to reconcile that what you're doing is the solution to their distress, that they'll just keep digging in and they'll make you the problem. And that's what's essentially happening. That's what's happening to me, obviously. I can see it for what it is. And that is helpful. It doesn't make it okay. And I'm not justifying aggressive, abusive behavior by any means, but I also see it as trauma. Traumatized people are fighting back because it is so incredibly scary to question what they have been told to believe for forever.
Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. It's interesting too. I was thinking about my experience in terms of grooming for marriage as you were talking. And I don't know if I had this fantasy that I wanted to get married, but I had this fantasy of being in love. And that romantic, always, I just wanted someone to love me, which is rooted in other wounds, obviously.
Yeah.
Let's just say that. And I think that's also something I've been talking about with a lot of clients, is that we have other wounds, we have other traumas, we have other things that happen in our life. And then you throw in Mormonism or a high
religion
control
in general. Yeah.
Religion in general. Yeah. That has like outlines of what makes you worthy. It's just kind of a recipe for disaster. And so I always had a boyfriend. From preschool on, I remember having a boyfriend, and how important that was to my worth as a girl, as a little girl. You were tiny. My kids are in preschool right now, like tiny kindergarten. I remember kindergarten, like the boy I remember this is, you have parent teacher conferences. One of the things I got lectured for, or I talked too much to the boys. Obviously I grew up in small town.
They're like, you might want to put a pin in this, guys. Like she's going to be a problem.
It was that. Okay. That. And then I couldn't cut very good with scissors. I swear to you, to this day, I suck at cutting with scissors. And now all my boyfriends make sense. And like, fortunately, I was dating a guy when I was 18 who was a return missionary. I remember going to, like, coming home to he lived in Cedar City, coming home to Cedar City. I was in LA at college, and we would go to Singles Ward, of course, and we would meet with the bishop after church and talk about how we were prepping to get married, even though I was living in LA going to college. This was happening. And I thought I was going to move home my freshman year, and I was like, I'm going to have to move home and get married. Like, that's what I'm supposed to do. And I had some really great friends who were not LDS, and they were like, you're not moving home and getting married. That's crazy talk. You're crazy. Yeah. You're crazy to doing that. You're not doing it. Literally, my best guy friend who actually married me and my husband, which is so funny. I remember we went on a run, and he was like, you're not going home and getting married. Like, you're not moving home. You're coming back to LMU next year. I was like, no, I don't. I think I got to, but I didn't. Like, how,
yeah.
If there's a God, like, thank you. I didn't. And that saved my life.
And that is, I think there are far more women than not, and men maybe too, right? That would look
Absolutely.
back on that same moment who ended up married and wish they had had people who intervened for them. Because part of the issue is everybody cheers you on. when you go to do
Absolutely.
that, the adulation you receive, and the crowning moment where you can stroll into the family ward and like, we did it. And like you're welcomed in, and then you're spoken to differently and you're treated differently. And I think as someone who has been single for so long, and as in like not engaged or married ever, I think so many people in the church, when they hear my experience, they're so confused, because I think there's a lot of people in my position who just don't speak about it because they
Absolutely
just
not.
think that they are the problem.
Mm.
And I like, if there is the thing I found so funny was, I remember when Russell M. Nelson became the prophet, I still was like in it at that point, starting to like have some distance, but I was still like involved. And I remember he was going through and he was changing everything, right? Down to nursery. They were changing things. Changed the amount of time that we go to church, right? Not a single change to the singles ward. Not a single adjustment to the structure, not a moment of reflection for it, nothing. And that is why they are hemorrhaging membership in the millennial and Gen Z category, is because it never worked. It didn't work. And it was so toxic, and it was so filled with shame, and it was so infantilizing. But you're groomed to think that is the holding pen you need to be in until you decide to woman up, make some sacrifices, and just pick one of these very nice, fine boys to be with.
Absolutely. And
Yes.
It's all normalized. Just like you said.
Yep.
It's all normalized. No one ever says, what the fuck? Like my friends in college with me who grew up completely outside of Mormon culture were like, you're not going home, Ash. You're not going to get married. That is stupid. That is dumb. That's not what we do at 19 years old. Because it's not.
And again, like, I'm sharing this situation not as like, I have processed a lot of this stuff. Like, I'm able to share this from a place of like, I've done the work, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I also just want to say that I think what Sam is sharing is so resonant for so many women in the church. And that was what came up a lot actually in this grooming series, of just feeling such low self-esteem, such low self-worth, so much shame for not being married. And I think exactly what you're speaking to.
And I credit my being raised in New York and the friends that I have from there and still have from there for being the foundational confidence that I had to be like, nah, this isn't what everybody else is doing. Right? But then now there's the grief. I've been working through some grief periodically around what I missed out on in my early 20s. Because I was in that environment, so involved, right? And kind of this reckoning of like, am I behind in life compared to everybody else from this? Or and that's just trauma talking, right? Like, there's no legitimate timeline for how you live your life. And your life is your life and your past is your past. And part of the internal work, especially if you find yourself weighed down by this idea of, I think I was groomed for something I didn't want, or maybe wasn't ready for, and now I feel stuck with it, right? It's not about trying to figure out all the different ways it could have been different, because that's a recipe for insanity. You have to drive through that town, if you will. Like, through the road of healing.
You have to hold space for it, but you can't unpack and live there.
You can't move in there. You can't buy real estate there. Like, and so I share that to say the work here is around making peace with what you do have, being able to hold space for the complexity of it, and deciding how you can move forward and make decisions from a place that does feel authentically yours.
Absolutely.
Instead of feeling like you're making decisions because it's what a system told you need to do, or it's what your grandparents told you need to do, or your parents or your siblings, or, you know, whatever the expectation was that you have to do XYZ and you have to be happy about it.
Absolutely. I was thinking too, I think for me, I when my husband and I were dating, and we had been dating probably we met in 2012. We weren't married till 2016. Yeah. So 4 years, which is actually kind of short in the grand scheme of things. But I remember I was about 2 years into it, 3 years into it. And I had so much angst and so much stress about getting engaged. And when was he going to propose? How come he hadn't proposed yet? And I just thought it was because of the stage of life I was in. And since doing this series, I'm like, oh my gosh, no, it's because I still deep down in my being, my condition of worthiness was on being a married woman. And I love my husband so incredibly much. I say all the time is like, he's like the guy that my soul always needed him. And I think part in it and kind of what you're talking about, I'm still like, oh, maybe that, like, would I have chosen to get married then? I think we still would have got married, but would I have could we have waited longer, had more time? I don't know. Possibly, to like this point of like, I'm not going to unpack and live there. I'm just going to acknowledge. I'm going to grieve the unnecessary anxiety I felt, maybe the pressure I put on him. And I think part of reconciling that was to be able to even go back to him and say, you remember when we were getting engaged and I was like so crazy about it? I actually think it's related to my upbringing and like the freedom of that and the repair of that, like in moving through it, just acknowledging it for what it is just holding space for it. I think that's kind of what you're getting to, right? Like, how do we make peace for it? I think part of making peace is acknowledging that it's real and it impacted us. And that doesn't mean we have to change our choice or do something different.
Right. And if you are someone that is married and you have kids, it is really important for you to sit in gratitude of, you know what, if I did make this decision, I'm really glad I found a good man or a good woman. Right? Like that's okay. It's not sitting here saying that you now have to look at this and be like, oh my God, I did everything wrong. Like I have to leave you now because of XYZ. No. It's about you getting to speak truth about your truth and you feeling empowered enough to say, you know what, this wasn't what I wanted to do. And I feel very lucky that it worked out. Right? Like that, that can be a very real part of it, along with maybe some of you looking at this person and being like, I don't love you. Right? Like that truth is just as powerful and necessary as the other one, and vice versa. So I think a lot of this too is about like you making space to look at your own experience and decide what some of this meant for you. And what are some of the regrets that you have? What are some of the things that you wish were different? What are the things that worked out for you? Right? Like it's all of it, everything, everywhere, all at once.
Absolutely. And I think the last thing I'll say to even just this point is I think there's also this middle, and I have several clients that are like, I just don't know. I don't know. Right. Do I want to stay married? Do I not? And when that comes up, we hold space for it. And my encouragement and my kind of the focus is, well, let's just work on your relationship with you. Like your own foundation, because I think a lot of our own foundation as women were stripped from us. And so I think we have to almost start there too, if we're in the middle of not knowing. Yeah. And you don't have to make a decision. You don't have to choose, do I stay married? Do I get divorced? None of it. You don't have to choose any of that. You just hold space for the here and now and where you're at and ground into that and be curious and be open and get to know yourself too. I think there's a lot of power
when
in
I
that.
made the decision to move out of Utah, I sat in that space for quite some time, figuring out, do I want to leave Utah because I actually want to leave Utah? Am I leaving Utah because I want to like run away? Right? Like, do I actually like it here? Could I build a life here? Right? And after allowing that gray space, I was able to come to, no, I need to leave immediately. Like, not okay. But that was for me. But because I allowed that space of, there is no wrong decision here. If you stay and build a life here, you can find happiness here. If you leave, you can find happiness elsewhere. And the scales tip to greater happiness outside of there. And in the last 2 months, that has proved to be true. But like, it's a complex process, and it is an overwhelming thing to sit with as well. And I think that's kind of like what we're speaking about, is it's very emotionally flooding when you start to kind of let some of this stuff come to the surface, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. That doesn't mean that you can't handle it. It just means that we're tending to a very fresh wound that is actually very old.
Absolutely. And what is coming up for me too, and I just want to I want to say, I want to share this. I want to share this for the listeners. I mean, and I view myself as someone who I've deconstructed. Yeah. I just deconstructed a long time ago. I have a lot of life experience outside of the church. I've done so much of my own healing and my own reconciliation of just my traumas, religious and not. And this series stirred up some real shit in my being, even related to motherhood. And I love my children. I'm so grateful for them. And also I was like, but did I choose to have kids because I genuinely wanted to, or because of some of this culture? And I think the answer is both.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
You know, I think it's both. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And that doesn't make me a bad mom. And that doesn't make anyone a bad mom. No. Right? Because when you are told from the time you're tiny that getting married and having babies is your end all be all, how do you choose different? You know? And then like on the flip side of that, for someone in your shoes, Sam, and anyone who's listening that's in your shoes, how do you process when you're single and you don't have babies? How does that impact you? You know, on that level. So it's deep.
It is.
I have some submissions.
Let's do it.
All right. I'm just going to go. I always appreciate when everyone writes in. Okay. I was told by my mother that if I would pray and read my scriptures and learn to be a good housewife, my boyfriend at the time would ask me to marry him. Oh, and she added on, he will never marry you if you continue to wear shorts that are short. You'll probably embarrass him.
Yikes.
I mean, what's coming up for me too is immediately was the normalization of this.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, also to a little bit of grooming by mom. And I don't say this to pathologize mom or anything. I think mom is doing what she's been taught to do, but it's the grooming's happening everywhere, not even just at church,
thinking
right?
She's protecting her by giving her this information.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. It's just so much. And this is, I guess I should say, listener, while she's reading these, I also have the email pulled up where she sent me all of these submissions to review. And so I'm just reading this back and being like, it's so tragic. It is so tragic and small-minded to say, well, you have to pray for this person to marry you. And by the way, how you dress is an indication of your worth. And that you have no worth in the clothing that you're in. There's a lot to unpack in that one. So if you wrote that one in, I want you to go out. There's actually a trend for spring that is the micro short. I want you to go get them. I don't care. I don't care. I want you to go get the micro short, and I want you to wear it outside everywhere. And I want you to flaunt and be proud and put yourself out there and live your life. That is what I have to say.
Absolutely.
To that submission.
Yes. Snaps. Amen.
I want you to go get the tiniest shorts you can find immediately. I want you underwear, thong, bikini all the time. I want you go be free. You have permission from a therapist. God. And you can quote me. I don't care. I'll fight her.
I know, I agree. I think it's the control that's
Yes.
exhibited over women's bodies. It's also why we're here. It's also really made me think about a lot, like even as a therapist and just like the clothing that I'm allowed to wear or I'm not allowed to wear, and who decides this bullshit?
Men.
Who decides it? Exactly. Oh, speaking of men, let's go to the next one. My grandpa asked me why I wasn't married yet every time he saw me, starting from when I was 16. I once answered that I hadn't found anyone I liked enough yet, and he point blank said it didn't matter if I liked who I married. The guy just had to think I was pretty. When I did this series, the thing that came up for me, and these are all new submissions, they're not from my series, but did you ever watch Keep Sweet, Pray, and Obey? Yeah. That came up for me the whole entire time.
Yeah.
Because it felt so eerily similar to conditioning. And obviously, I think there's different levels and different layers, obviously. But I haven't been able to shake it since.
I also think the last chunk of that, the guy just had to think I was pretty. That is alluding to breeding. That's what that is saying. He has to think you are attractive enough to want to have sex with you. That is what that last phrase means.
Absolutely. I mean, and then we're talking about a whole, so, and I will say this, spicy, grooming for marriage and also grooming for sex and grooming for sexual exploitation, in my opinion, because women are not taught, and neither are men, quite frankly, about consent in the church.
Yeah.
No one
men are taught to, it's glossed over as protecting, right? But really what we're talking about is owning. And when he's saying it doesn't matter if I like him, the guy just had to think I was pretty. It doesn't matter how he treats you. It doesn't matter what his expectations are. It doesn't matter what your expectations are. It doesn't matter what you want. This just needs to be someone who is willing to procreate with you.
Okay, what's coming up for me right now is when I lived in San Diego, I did specific training for sexually exploited children, girls. And the training, I worked at high schools. Gang members would come to the schools that, like, obviously high school teenage gang members would be on the school campuses to groom vulnerable girls. And this is exactly how it was done. The promise of community, they bought things for them, blessings, right? Like, and as long as they looked pretty and guys wanted them, that's all that mattered. And I oftentimes think about this training that I had, and I worked with many girls over the course of time that I worked in San Diego. And the tactics are eerily similar. Yeah. And that's a very spicy take, and people don't want to hear that comparison. But I will say that gangs are a high control group. And they promise community and support and relationships.
And there's strict hierarchical systems. There's a chain of command.
Absolutely.
Everybody knows where everybody stands and what their roles are.
And one of the ways that they got the girls was that they made the girls feel empowered, that they were beautiful, that they loved them, like literally wolf in sheep's clothing. That's how they got them. And it's horrible. I mean, but it was a whole entire industry in gang culture and still is to this day. So, anyways, throwing that spicy take out there. This is a spicy episode. Making wedding time capsules when I was 12 and thinking about how immodest the dresses I liked were.
Yeah.
I never made a wedding time capsule.
No, I didn't. We would kind of like, if I remember correctly, there would kind of be activities where we would like jokingly plan our weddings.
Yes. I always was. I mean, did you play MASH?
All the time.
All the time. Obsessed with MASH. I actually want to whip that. We should play that.
You don't need it. I do. Gotta whip out that manifestation game, right? The girlies were working overtime with the manifestation on that one. Jeez. Hoy. Yeah, I think the immodest dresses part, I remember like there were certain clothes that I like really liked and really wanted to wear, and there was kind of this like martyr element in my brain that was like, oh, like we just can't do that. And now I'm like, yeah, no, I'm gonna wear whatever I want.
I remember we didn't do capsules, but I got to wear my aunt's wedding dress, and I was obsessed with it. I loved it. It was so beautiful. I remember the young women's activity. I was 12.
So unsettling.
And I think it's different, right? Because I think I don't have daughters, but if I had a daughter and she wanted to try on my wedding dress, absolutely, like that's so fun. But the whole idea of it being a church activity is bizarre.
Well, and I think there's a caveat I want to add here too, is like it is fine to talk to your children about marriage. We are not saying that the institution of marriage is the problem. What we're saying, the nuance to this is the problem is when you are made to feel that A, there are no other options, B, it requires you compromising on values and authenticity in order to achieve that, and C, to be driven to that option before you are developmentally able to make that decision on your own.
Exactly. Amen.
And so to have your daughter or your son come to you, whether you're a mom or a dad or whatever, and talk to you about that, talking about it is not the problem. But to then remind them, you are a child. I promise you, we will have this conversation when we need to have this conversation. You don't need to be worried about this right now.
Yeah, it's actually really funny. So my son is, he'll be 6 actually in a couple weeks, but so he's in kindergarten, and we live in small town Utah, right? So one of his little friends, he came home and told me, he's like, hey, mom, so-and-so said that she's going to marry me or her cousin. You know, just drops that. And I'm like, oh, tell me what you think about that, honey. Because he obviously knows what marriage is. Like, he knows, because my husband and I are married and we've talked about it in what's age appropriate for him. Like, mommy and daddy decided to get married, but because he'll often ask like, oh, am I going to marry you, mom? You know, like normal little kid stuff. And I've always explained it to him like, no, you're going to leave Cedar, where hopefully we don't still live here. You're going to go to college. You're going to meet a lot of people, and then you'll decide who you're going to get married. And going to marry. And I always say, mommy didn't meet daddy until she was 24 years old. And so that's kind of what I said back to him. And I was like, oh, do you remember how old mommy was when she met daddy? And he's like, oh yeah, like 24. Like, yeah, I think so-and-so is just being silly. And I can't even remember what else I said, but I didn't denounce marriage. I didn't tell him he was never going to get married. I didn't even ask about it. I just was like, oh yeah, that's just that, like, that's probably not going to happen. You're not going to marry who you go to kindergarten with. And he went on his merry little way. And we haven't talked about it since, because it's not that big of a deal. It's not that deep. But I think here in Utah, it is that deep. I mean, I was 5 and thinking about who I was marrying.
Anyway.
So hopefully that helps you guys. I think we can normalize marriage and talk about marriage all the time without grooming our children to get married. This reminded me that when I went to BYU at 18 years old, I didn't want to write my last name on any of my kitchen stuff because I knew as a teenager that I would probably get married and change my last name before graduating college. This is not funny. It was a conscious decision led by this logic.
Oh my God.
I mean, this is how deep it runs. I mean, like, I'm giggling as I read this, but to me it's deep. Like, this is just what you...
So I didn't go to BYU. I went to UVU for undergrad. I mean, it might as well have been like BYU adjacent, but my sister went to BYU and she was an athlete there, and she has since like deconstructed as well. But she remembers like being in college and they would be in like their institute classes or whatever. And she says there was a girl that stood up and she was 20 years old and she was weeping like openly in front of people that she had not been chosen to be married. And that she was classifying that as, what's the word I'm looking for? A trial. Like she had been given this trial that she was 20 and wasn't yet married. And it's just so like, I chuckle because to be now 5 lifetimes removed from that. If I was sitting in a room with a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-old girls and they were crying about that, I now would stand up and say, ladies, I am here to tell you right now, like, please go talk to somebody about this. Like, this is
Absolutely.
nobody else in the world is worried about this. No one.
No one.
No one.
No one
And
is.
I say that not to diminish it, but to validate the life position that you're in. Like, I would feel irresponsible as an adult, allowing that type of conversation to take place.
Yeah. Well, and what's coming up for me too, like about the whole writing your last name on your kitchen stuff, right? To me, you should not even have been worrying about that at
No.
18 years old. That even should that should not have been
No.
something that was on your mind, and yet it is so real and it is
Yeah.
so valid
Right.
in this culture.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about like the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives and thinking about all the women on that show and how young all of them were when they got married.
Yep.
And just again, it's this normalized part of Mormon culture. And while whatever anyone's feelings are about that show, it is also shedding some light to how this happens.
100%.
Okay, I really wanted to read this one. As a 48-year-old woman of 5 adult children and empty nester, I've been deconstructing how I got to my age without really knowing who I am outside my role as a mother and wife. I realized I never had goals or dreams to do anything else, and that the church grew me to not even think about anything different. They conditioned me to believe I would disappoint Heavenly Father, and I could get an education, but it should be a degree that you could fall back on if something happened to my husband. I was also taught not to postpone having children. Your previous grooming discussion jogged my memories of being a young girl having activities where we talked about marriage and motherhood frequently, while the boys our age were out doing age-appropriate activities and learning camping skills. They weren't being asked to write letters to their future spouse, putting on tuxedos and taking pictures in them, and making white handkerchiefs for their wedding. My father wasn't a member and was adamant on me getting an education and not getting married so young, and yet the church ended up having a bigger influence than my father. I got married young and then had 5 children in 7 years, never finished my 4-year degree, and now I sit here trying to figure out who I am and what even interests or inspires me. There's a lot of shame and grief I'm processing. This submission broke my heart, and I just want to hold space for it. It's really heavy. And I think it really highlights the impact, like the larger picture impact of this conversation.
It's like it's making me emotional. And I think I'm really hoping the woman who wrote this, if you are listening, I'm speaking straight to you. And also, if you relate to this and you're listening, I don't care what age you are, and you relate to this in some form, I'm speaking directly to you. None of this is your fault. None of this is your fault. You made decisions with the best information that you had at the time. And you were taken advantage of, and you were manipulated, and you were preyed upon. And I am so sorry that someone told you to ignore the advice of your dad when you were in a young and vulnerable place and seeking validation from this community that I'm sure was incredibly important to you and that you wanted to be a part of. And please, 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 please spend some time thinking about your dreams. that you are still so young. You are young. There's potential. There's opportunity. I don't care what that is. I am calling on you, if this is you who wrote this, or you are hearing that and tears are in your eyes because you relate so much. I am calling on you to start taking care of you. I don't care what age your kids are. I don't care what stage of life you're in. I am begging you to take some time for you, to think of what your dreams are, what matters to you, what you want from life, and how you can achieve that in the life that you are in. And I am here to, I know as a therapist, this doesn't work. I can't tell you to stop feeling shame because that's not how it works. However, I want to extend you the permission to release yourself of the shame that this was some fault of yours.
Yeah.
I don't know. That just is very naturally what came up for me in this.
Yeah, and that's when I see the words the shame again, like that's the self-blame piece. And I even want to just the part of your father really stood out to me, right? And not listening to his advice. And I want to say that when you grow up in this culture that places so much emphasis on a worthy priesthood holder, it teaches you how to not listen to your father who's not that, right? And to me, a lot of ways that's protective. Your nervous system, like, hey, we're going to do this to keep you safe. And to give yourself some grace for that, because you were doing what you believed was the right thing to do based on what had been dealt to you. And that's not your fault. And I'm just sending you a hug. And young you a hug too.
And you're incredibly brave for writing this out. It's very brave to do.
And to be able to see it for what it is, right? And to bring it to the surface, because I think that is the hardest, scariest, most activating part, to name all of these things. Because like once you name them, they're there. And there really isn't going back once we've uncovered it. All right, we're going to jump into the last submission. Both of my parents were conceived out of wedlock by Mormon parents. The social acceptable norms were different then than they are now. If I had done that as a youth, I would have been ostracized by my community. Mormon theology uses marriage as the only escape for sexual repression and traps people into deeply rooted commitments before they have time to see the whole picture. That way, if you have doubts about the church, it will be a betrayal of your marriage rather than a personal choice. Grooming for marriage is designed to trap people in the belief system and enforcing compliance through social pressures. Encouraging early child rearing also limits the potential of most members and further reinforces the barbs that trap people in the church.
Well, that's it. Thanks.
I mean, what's coming up for me is I don't know if I've fully looked at it in this lens. Like the word trap. But when I think about women and the oppression of women, that's essentially what comes up for me. And I have a close friend who, she's like from South America, and I don't know, I can't like identify the tribe, but she was saying that there was a time when women were like it was
matriarchal society. Yeah.
Yes. And then what happened? And I often think they probably threatened their offspring, because how do you get a woman to submit, and how do you get control over a woman? You threaten their children. Or you have like, that's what I'm thinking. Like, these women get married so young, they have babies, and they're trapped in these marriages because you don't want to like go and not be able to provide for your baby.
And I think it absolutely is. And I think what I will give a modicum of credit for the church is I think this is an issue across religions, right? Like part
1,000% across
the world, this is a problem with not having access to birth control, with not having access to reproductive rights and freedom. Because to have a child, and I tell my clients this when I have clients who are weighing whether or not they want to have a child, the thing that I always say is I'm like, look, this is how you have to look at it. And this is not me disparaging it as someone who would like to be a mom one day. And it is the one thing you cannot undo. You can undo a marriage and you can walk away and never have to see them again. To have a child, that is the one thing you cannot do a trial run of and then change your mind. And I don't care what, I don't care how many times you said you babysat or whatever. Like, it's not the same. And so because men also know when you limit a woman's financial capacity, her earning potential, because she didn't get a high earning degree, because she didn't get a degree that has a lot of job prospects, right? You have now cut her off at the kneecaps of what she can do without you. And not all men, right? Like, I know some of you are like, not all men. I know that there are probably really incredible men listening to this right now who are so supportive and loving of their wives and want the world for them. And you are the best. And we need you to stand up now more than ever and call truth to power to your fellow brothers. And there are men that know this. There are men that know by getting a woman pregnant young and early and cutting her off, you have removed her from any opportunity that she could have to find a way out from leaving you.
Well, and I also think we have to take into consideration the history and the foundation of Mormonism, and especially the polygamy aspect and the young brides and all of it. I think it's so intertwined here in that culture. So again, like Sam says, this oppression happens everywhere on a large scale. And also I think in certain areas, in certain places, because Mormonism is not the only high control religion that exists in our world, it's under a microscope, this oppression of women. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of my own mom too, because she got pregnant with me. And then her and my dad got married 3 months later, and my dad was not a member of the church. So you can only imagine there's lots of layers there. That's very layered. But I mean, that had to feel like her only option. Like, it genuinely had to feel like her only option. And I don't know if she so much has said that to me, but I know she felt incredible amounts of shame. Right? Because now she's pregnant in a culture that says you can't have sex before you get married. And if you're pregnant, we all know you had sex. Right?
And I think every single person listening to this podcast, if you were raised in the Mormon community, you can think of examples of some of the worst relationships that you know of are the result of being forced together when everybody else in the room knew that was the stupidest idea ever. But everybody just kind of hung their heads of like, they have to now.
No one, if you get pregnant, you do not have to get married.
You do not have to do that. You get to do whatever you want.
Yeah. I think that's a really important note to end on. That there are choices, and maybe you didn't get to make those choices for yourself personally, but you also get to be the cycle breakers. You get to do things differently. And maybe you're raising your kids in this culture, and then they come home and they tell you they want to get married, and you get to be that adult that says, I actually don't think this is a good idea. You get to be those friends that I had, right? This is why this is not smart. This is what's going to happen. And you get to educate them on that. So any final words, Sam?
Just be kind to yourself. As you're doing this work and you're sorting through all of it, I think it's really important to remember that there are a lot of times where you thought you had agency, but you actually didn't. And
absolutely,
it's okay to own that. And it's okay that the things that you've been through have impacted you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Bye.
Until next time. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If today's content resonated with you, please share, leave a review, all the things. It would mean so much to me.